The age of the Vikings was a furnace that tested the steel of kings. From the smoke and ashes of Alfred the Great's wars rose a son, Edward, called the Elder. Overshadowed by his legendary father, his reign is often overlooked, yet it was Edward, not Alfred, who truly forged the path to a united England. He was not a boy king swept away by scandal, nor a tragic prince consumed by passion, but a warrior hardened by ceaseless battle, a ruler tempered by strategy, and a king who expanded Wessex's dominion into something greater. Between 899 and 924, Edward fought Danes, subdued rebellious nobles, allied with Mercia, and set the very foundations of England itself. This is the saga of Edward the Elder, the son of Alfred, who inherited not just a crown, but a kingdom still bleeding from war. Edward was born around 874, at a time when Viking longships carved terror into England's coasts. His father, Alfred of Wessex, was already in the crucible of defending his kingdom against the Danes. Unlike many royal children, Edward was not raised in luxury but in hardship. His youth was one of discipline, learning, and preparation for rule. Chroniclers describe him as intelligent, brave, and dutiful, a prince trained in both letters and arms. He studied the scriptures and strategies of kingship, but also rode with warriors, fought in campaigns, and understood firsthand the weight of command. He grew up not only as Alfred's heir, but as the living embodiment of continuity in a time when Wessex could have vanished into Viking conquest. When Alfred the Great died in 899, England trembled. His passing left a void. Would the fragile realm he defended endure or collapse into chaos? Edward was chosen king, but not without resistance. His cousin, Ethelred, son of Alfred's elder brother Edmund, disputed the throne. Ethelred fled north, rallied support among the Danes of Northumbria and East Anglia, and returned with fire in his heart. This was not just a family squabble, it was a battle for the destiny of Wessex. In 901 to 902, the War of Succession erupted. The decisive clash came at the Battle of the Holm, 902. Ethelred was killed, but so were many English nobles. Edward, though victorious, learned an early lesson. A king's greatest enemies could rise not from foreign shores, but from his own blood. Edward's reign was not solitary. His greatest ally was his formidable sister, Ethelred, Lady of the Mercians. Married to Ethelred, ruler of Mercia, she became a warrior queen in her own right, leading armies, building fortresses, and fighting Danes with unmatched resolve. When Ethelred died in 911, Ethelred ruled Mercia, alone, something nearly unheard of in Anglo-Saxon England. The brother-sister alliance became the hammer and anvil of English power. Edward in the south, Ethelred in the north, together pressing the Danes on every front. Their strategy was genius, a chain of burhs fortified towns built across the land, each a spear of stone and timber against Viking raids. This system, begun by Alfred, was expanded ruthlessly under Edward and Ethelred. It was not just military, it was political, economic, and cultural dominance reshaping England's landscape. From 910 onward, Edward waged relentless campaigns against the Danish-ruled lands in England. In 910, his armies, together with Mercian forces, crushed a Viking host at the Battle of Tettenhall, killing several Danish kings. Victory after victory followed. Towns like Bedford, Derby, Leicester, and Nottingham fell into Edward and Ethelflaed's grasp. Each fortress taken was another nail and the coffin of the Danelaw. By 918, Ethelred captured York, though she died shortly after, leaving Edward to consolidate power. He swiftly absorbed Mercia into his rule, ensuring that for the first time Wessex and Mercia were united under one crown. Edward's ambition stretched beyond the Danes. He demanded submission from the Welsh princes, who acknowledged his overlordship. Even Constantine II, King of Scotland, recognized Edward's supremacy in 920. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle boasts that kings from Wales, Scotland, and even Strathclyde came to Edward and chose him as father and lord. Whether out of fear or respect, Edward stood as the overlord of Britain, an extraordinary transformation from the days when his father Alfred fought merely to keep Wessex alive. Edward's personal life was as complex as his politics. He had several marriages and many children, at least 14, possibly more. His children would shape England's destiny for generations. From his first marriage came Athelstan, who would succeed him and become one of England's greatest kings. His daughters married into powerful European dynasties, extending Wessex influence across the continent. Other sons, like Edmund and Edred, would rule England in turn, continuing the line of Alfred. Edward was not just the son of a great king. He was the father of kings and queens, a patriarch whose bloodline defined the English crown. Even in his later years, Edward did not rest. In 924, a revolt erupted in Mercia and Northumbria against his rule. Edward marched north, crushed the rebellion, and reasserted his dominion. But the campaign took its toll. Soon after quelling the uprising, Edward fell ill and died at Farndon in Cheshire on July 17, 924. He was buried in Winchester beside his father, Alfred the Great. Edward the Elder reigned for 25 years longer than many kings of his age. Yet history has often placed him in Alfred's shadow. But consider his achievements. He defeated his dynastic rival Thelwold. He expanded Wessex into Mercia, forging the beginnings of a united English kingdom. He broke the power of the Danes and pushed them back. He won the submission of Wales and Scotland. He fathered a dynasty that would dominate England for a century. If Alfred was the defender of England, Edward was the builder of England. In the Chronicles, he is called the Elder, perhaps to distinguish him from his son, Edward the Martyr, or later kings of the same name. But the epithet carries a deeper weight. He was the elder in wisdom and labor in the forging of England's destiny. He lived not in the glow of legend like Alfred, nor in the tragic poetry of kings like Eadwig, but in the hard stone of castles, the smoke of battlefields, and the silent obedience of conquered rulers. Edward the Elder was no myth. He was the Iron King who took Alfred's dream and hammered it into reality. And though history often forgets him, England itself is his monument. The year was 925, a time of turbulence, ambition, and destiny. Upon the death of King Edward the Elder, the son of Alfred the Great, the Anglo-Saxon world was thrust into a new chapter. The Viking threat still loomed like a storm cloud over the British Isles. Rival kings plotted in Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, and loyalties within England itself were fragile. Into this crucible of uncertainty stepped Athelstan, Edward's son, grandson of the legendary Alfred the Great. His reign, though only 14 years, would reshape the destiny of Britain forever. For Athelstan was not destined to be merely a king of Wessex, nor just a regional overlord of Saxon lands. He would be remembered as the first ruler who made the bold claim and proved it with sword, diplomacy, and law that he was truly king of all England. Athelstan's bloodline carried the weight of destiny. His grandfather Alfred had been the great defender of Wessex during the darkest Viking invasions, keeping alive the fragile hope of an English nation. His father, Edward the Elder, had expanded Alfred's dream by conquering Danish strongholds and securing Mercia, but Athelstan's childhood gave him something unique. Raised partly at the court of Thulfold, the Lady of the Mercians, his aunt and one of the most powerful women in Anglo-Saxon history, he absorbed Mercian culture and loyalty. This upbringing gave him a dual identity, the authority of Wessex kingship combined with the respect of Mercian warriors. He was a bridge between two great Anglo-Saxon houses, and this made him uniquely suited to unify a divided realm. Athelstan's succession was not smooth. His half-brother Glad was also a contender for the throne, and though Glaive died mysteriously only weeks after Edward the Elder, opposition lingered. Many nobles of Wessex looked on Athelstan with suspicion, preferring a homegrown Wessex heir. Some even whispered that he was illegitimate, though this was never proven. Yet Mercia rose in his favor. It was in Mercia that he was first proclaimed king, and it was Mercian loyalty that gave him the strength to push forward. By September 925, Athelstan was formally crowned at Kingston upon Thames, a site that would later become sacred ground for English coronations. But even as he wore the crown, rival factions waited for him to stumble. Where others hesitated, Athelstan acted boldly. He refused to accept the limited titles of his predecessors, King of Wessex or King of the Anglo-Saxons. His ambition was larger. Through campaigns of conquest and treaties, he pushed his influence north, east, and west, forcing lords and rulers to acknowledge him. By 927, the decisive moment came. He seized York, the Viking stronghold in Northumbria. For nearly a century, Norse kings and jarls had held power there, threatening Saxon lands and independence. Its fall was a turning point. With York under his control, Athelstan's realm stretched from the English Channel to the Firth of Forth. No king before him had wielded such dominion. Chroniclers began to call him not just King of the Anglo-Saxons, but King of the English. And thus the dream of a united England was born in truth. Athelstan's greatness was not only on the battlefield, he was also a brilliant diplomat, weaving England into the tapestry of European politics. He married his sisters into the royal houses of France, Burgundy, and Germany. His court became a glittering hub of envoys, scholars, and warriors from across the continent. Poets praised him, clerics sought his patronage, and princes competed for his favor. Chroniclers describe his court as the most cosmopolitan in Europe of the age, a place where the old warrior traditions of the Saxons met the refined culture of Christendom. He corresponded with kings and emperors, including Otto the Great of Germany, and was hailed abroad as a ruler of stature equal to any on the continent. England, once seen as a backwater battered by Vikings, now stood as a respected kingdom under Athelstan's hand. Yet Athelstan knew that victory and diplomacy were not enough to hold a kingdom together. A realm must also be bound by law. He issued a series of legal codes that sought to unify the kingdom under a single vision of justice. He cracked down on theft, punished corruption, and issued rules for land ownership and inheritance. He emphasized responsibility. Lords were to be accountable for the conduct of their men, and communities were bound together to maintain peace. The spirit of these laws echoed the reforms of his grandfather Alfred the Great, but Athelstan expanded them to fit a larger, more diverse kingdom. In doing so, he laid foundations for English law that would echo for centuries. Despite his achievements, danger never slept. The Norse Vikings, though beaten at York, still lurked across the sea in Ireland and the Isles. The kings of Scotland and Strathclyde resented his dominance, and alliances formed in secret. In 934, Athelstan struck first, leading a massive campaign into Scotland. He marched north with both land and naval forces, subduing King Constantine II of Alba. Constantine submitted for a time, but the humiliation brewed bitterness. By 937, rebellion exploded. A grand coalition formed. Constantine of Scotland, Olaf Guthfrithson of Dublin, and Owain of Strathclyde joined forces. They raised an immense army, larger than any seen before in the British Isles, and marched south to crush Athelstan's fragile unity. What followed was one of the most legendary battles in English history, Brunanburh. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle, usually terse and understated, bursts into heroic verse when describing it. Never before was there such slaughter on this island, never since. As the books of old tell us, the battlefield became a sea of blood. The allied armies of Scots, Norse, and Britons clashed against the shield walls of the English. Athelstan fought with ferocity, supported by his younger brother Edmund, who would one day be king himself. By the battle's end, the coalition was shattered. Constantine fled, his son slain. Olaf's forces were broken, and Owain's men cut down. Brunanburh secured England's destiny. It was the moment that proved Athelstan's right to be called the first king of all England. For generations after, Brunanburh was remembered as the battle that defined the English nation. After Brunanburh, no one doubted Athelstan's supremacy. He was overlord not only of England, but wielded influence in Wales, Scotland, and even Ireland. Continental rulers addressed him as an equal, sometimes even as a superior. He was, in the eyes of many, the most powerful king in Western Europe of his day, but destiny was cruel. On the 27th of October 939, Athelstan died in Gloucester at about 45 years old. He had no sons, and his brother Edmund succeeded him. Athelstan was buried in Malmesbury Abbey, a monastery he had cherished and enriched with gifts. Unlike other kings of Wessex and England, he was not buried at Winchester, but at Malmesbury, among monks and scholars who remembered him as both warrior and patron. Athelstan's reign lasted only 14 years, yet his impact was immeasurable. His grandfather Alfred had defended England. His father Edward had expanded it, but Athelstan had united it. He was the first king to rule over a realm that could truly be called England. His court was Europe's envy, his laws laid foundations for order, and his victory at Brunanburh echoed in song for centuries. Later chroniclers would sometimes overshadow him with Alfred the Great, but modern historians recognize Athelstan as perhaps the greatest of the early English kings. Without him, there might never have been an England at all. In the sweep of history, kings rise and fall, but few can claim to have created a nation. Athelstan did. From divided kingdoms, he forged unity. From constant war, he brought law and order. From chaos, he built the beginnings of England. His reign may have lasted only 14 years, but his shadow stretched for centuries. To speak of England's birth is to speak of Athelstan, the Magnificent, the first king of all England. The year was 921, a time when England was not yet a united kingdom, but a fragile web of territories, some Saxon, some Danish, some still contested. Into this world was born Edmund, the son of the mighty Edward the Elder, and half-brother to the legendary Athelstan, the first king to truly call himself King of the English. As a boy, Edmund grew up in the shadow of his elder half-brother, Athelstan, whose reign, 924 to 939, shaped much of the Anglo-Saxon identity. Young Edmund learned not only the arts of war, swordsmanship, horsemanship, and shield tactics, but also the weight of kingship. He saw how kings had to be both warriors and diplomats, how battles were won, not only on the field, but at the negotiation table, and how loyalty was often as fragile as parchment. Athelstan had no sons, and so young Edmund would become his heir, whether he was ready for the burden or not. When Athelstan died in 939, his crown passed to Edmund. He was only 18 years old, barely a man, when he inherited not only the throne, but also a kingdom in crisis. For while Athelstan had achieved the dream of uniting much of England under one rule, unity in the 10th century was like sand. It slipped quickly through the fingers. The Danes of the Danelaw were restless. Old enemies from the north and across the Irish Sea smelled weakness. The very year Edmund ascended the throne, Olaf Guthfrithson, the Norse king of Dublin, invaded Northumbria and seized York, tearing it from English hands. The kingdom could have fractured then and there, but Edmund was no passive youth. He was cut from the same iron as his forefathers, kings like Alfred the Great and Edward the Elder, and he understood that to be king of the English meant constant battle against those who wished to destroy the fragile realm. Edmund's first years on the throne were soaked in war. In 940, he marched north to retake territory from the Norse. Battles raged in Mercia and the Danelaw, but Olaf was a formidable foe. The war dragged on, and Edmund had to face the grim reality that not all fights could be won with the sword alone. By 941, Olaf died suddenly, and his cousin Olaf Kieran, known as Olaf Sitrickson, took the throne in Dublin and York. Edmund, ever the calculating leader, seized the opportunity. In 942, he retook the 5 boroughs Leicester, Lincoln, Derby, Nottingham, and Stamford key Danish strongholds in the Midlands. This victory was more than symbolic. It showed the English that the young king could strike hard and reclaim land long lost to the Norse. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle praised this campaign, noting how Edmund brought these crucial cities under English rule. It was a moment of triumph that solidified his authority. But Edmund was not only a warrior, he was also a diplomat. After years of exhausting war, in 944, he drove the Norse kings from York, effectively reclaiming Northumbria for the English. Instead of endless bloodshed, he brokered peace treaties, showing wisdom beyond his years. One of his most remarkable political acts came in 945, when he conquered Strathclyde in what is now southern Scotland. Instead of ruling it directly, he handed it over to King Malcolm, the first of Scotland, on the condition that Malcolm became his ally. This was a masterstroke of realpolitik. Edmund secured peace on his northern border while strengthening ties with Scotland. This policy of forging alliances through both war and diplomacy became a cornerstone of the English. monarchy for centuries to come. Like his grandfather Alfred and his half-brother Athelstan, Edmund recognized that kingship was not only about swords and shields, but also about laws and justice. His nickname, the Magnificent, was not merely for his victories in battle, but also for his efforts to build a more stable and orderly kingdom. He issued laws to protect the church, strengthen royal authority, and curb blood feuds among noble families. He recognized the importance of the church as a stabilizing force, supporting monastic reform movements and strengthening ties with the clergy. These acts gave his reign a sense of legitimacy and divine favor, vital in an age when kings claimed their right to rule by the grace of God. Just as Edmund's reign was beginning to show promise, fate dealt a cruel hand. On May 26, 946, at the age of only 25, Edmund was attending a feast at Puckle Church in Gloucestershire. The hall was filled with laughter, feasting, and drink. But in a moment that would change history, a convicted outlaw named Lefa entered the hall. Accounts differ on exactly what happened, but the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells us that Edmund spotted the outlaw and, furious that such a man dared enter his home, attempted to eject him. In the struggle, Lefa stabbed the young king. Edmund bled out before his men could save him. The outlaw was cut down immediately, but the damage was done. A great king won who had defended England with both sword and diplomacy, who had reclaimed lost lands and forged peace with Scotland, was gone before he had even reached his prime. Edmund was buried at Glastonbury Abbey, a place that would become central to England's spiritual life. His death left behind two young sons, Eadwig and Edgar, who would one day take the throne themselves. Though his reign was brief, only 6 years, his impact was immense. He stabilized a kingdom in peril, reclaimed critical lands, and set the stage for the continued unification of England. His brother, Edred, succeeded him and carried on the work, but Edmund's achievements in both war and diplomacy were the foundation on which later kings would build. In time, his son Edgar the Peaceful reigned 959 to 975, would bring about one of the most stable and prosperous periods of Anglo-Saxon England. That golden age owed much to the blood, sweat, and sacrifice of Edmund the Magnificent. History often remembers the long-reigning monarchs, those who sat on the throne for decades. But sometimes it is the short-lived reigns that burn the brightest. Edmund I was king for only 6 years, yet in that brief time he fought like a lion, governed like a statesman, and died like a warrior defending his honor. His story is one of youthful vigor, of a king who was thrust into power too soon, yet bore its weight with courage. His enemies feared him, his allies respected him, and his people mourned him deeply. That is why more than 1,000 years later, he is still remembered not simply as Edmund, but as Edmund the Magnificent. The year was 946, and England was at a crossroads. The kingdom, stitched together by war, alliances, and blood, was fragile. King Edmund I, called the Magnificent, had just been slain in his prime at a banquet in Puckle Church. His sons, Eadwig and Edgar, were far too young to rule. Thus the crown passed to his younger brother, Edred, a man not as robust as his warrior predecessors, but whose destiny was no less great. Edred was no towering figure of battlefield glory. Instead, he was known for his fragile health. Contemporary chronicles hint at a condition that left him unable to digest food properly, weakening his body. Yet beneath this frail exterior lay a will of iron. where others relied on swords, Edred leaned on patience, cunning, and an unshakable belief that England must remain united, no matter the cost. For nearly a century, the Viking menace had haunted England. From the burning of Lindisfarne in 793 to the invasions of the great heathen army in the 9th century, England's soil had been watered with blood. Although Alfred the Great had struck the first major blow for unity, and Edward the Elder had carried his father a stream further, it was not until Edmund's campaigns that much of the Danelaw had been tamed. But in 946, the Viking threat had not vanished. In the north, the Kingdom of York remained unstable, a place where Scandinavian chieftains and Anglo-Saxon nobles vied for control. For Edred, keeping England whole meant subduing York and preventing it from falling into Viking hands once again. Edred was crowned king at Kingston upon Thames, the traditional site of West Saxon coronations. Here the bishops and lords pledged allegiance, and Edred swore his sacred oath to rule justly, to defend the church, and to safeguard the land from its enemies. But unlike his predecessors, he had an additional burden. His reign would not be defined by great military victories alone, but by the struggle against his own weakening body. Even in this, the English saw something admirable: a king who bore suffering with dignity, whose perseverance mirrored the endurance of the kingdom itself. Almost immediately, Edred faced his greatest challenge. The Kingdom of York, restless under Anglo-Saxon influence, declared for a Viking ruler once more. In 947, Eric Bloodaxe, the feared Norwegian king and son of Harold Fairhair, seized power in York. Eric's name was not earned lightly. His reputation was steeped in brutality and the ruthless slaying of rivals. Edred could not let this stand. To leave York in Viking hands was to risk the unraveling of all his forebears' achievements. In 948, he marched north with his fyrd, the levy of English warriors. His army ravaged Northumbria, burning villages and seizing supplies to break Viking control. The monasteries recorded the devastation. Edred's fury was no less than the fire of the invaders he fought against. At Tan Shelf, he confronted the rebellious Northumbrians. Though peace was briefly restored, the north was a tinderbox, ready to ignite again. The saga of Edred's reign and the story of Eric Bloodaxe are inseparable. For several years, Northumbria swayed between submission to Edred and defiance under Viking kings. Eric Bloodaxe was expelled, only to return. Other claimants rose, including Olaf Citrixson, known as Olaf Kieran. In 954, the final chapter of this struggle came. Eric Bloodaxe was betrayed and slain, reportedly on Stainmoor in the Pennines. With his death, Viking rule in York ended for good. For the first time in history, all of England from Wessex in the south to Northumbria in the north was firmly united under one crown, that of Edred. While he forged unity with a firm hand, Edred was constantly at war with his own body. Chroniclers noted how his health often failed him. He could barely eat without illness striking him down. Yet he never let weakness deter him from ruling. Unable to fight like his forefathers, Edred relied heavily on his counselors and on the church. Chief among his allies was Dunstan, Abbot of Glastonbury, later canonized as one of England's greatest saints. Dunstan guided Edred with wisdom, reinforcing the bond between king and church that would become the backbone of England's governance for generations. Edred's reign marked an era of increasing closeness between crown and church. His generosity to monasteries was legendary. He gave lavish gifts of land and wealth, strengthening the monastic communities that preserved learning, culture, and faith during these turbulent centuries. More than just piety, this was strategy. By securing the loyalty of the church, Edred bound the moral and spiritual heart of the kingdom to the monarchy. It was a partnership that would endure long after his death. Edred was the son of Edward the Elder and Adchifu of Kent, making him the grandson of Alfred the Great. His siblings were kings and queens themselves. Athelstan, his elder half-brother, had been England's first true king, while Edmund had carried the sword of unity. His nephews, Eadwig and Edgar, would continue the dynasty after him. Thus, Edred belonged to a family of rulers who, in less than a century, transformed Wessex from a regional power into the throne of all England. Though victorious over the Vikings and secure in his rule, Edred's body was failing. By the early 950s, his health had sharply declined. He spent much of his later reign in religious devotion, relying on his trusted advisors to oversee the kingdom's day-to-day affairs. In 955, at the age of around 32, Edred died at Frome in Somerset. His body was laid to rest in the Old Minster at Winchester, the burial place of West Saxon kings. His death marked the end of a reign both fragile and strong, fragile in health, strong in resolve. Edred is not remembered with the glory of Alfred the Great or the brilliance of Athelstan, yet his achievements were no less vital. He was the king who ensured that England remained united at its most precarious moment. By defeating Eric Bloodaxe and ending Viking rule in York, he secured the dream of his grandfather Alfred and his brother Athelstan: one kingdom, one crown, one England. His reign proved that strength is not always measured by muscle or sword arm. Sometimes it is measured in endurance, in patience, and in the quiet resolve to finish the work begun by others. Edred may have been weak in body, but in spirit he was unbreakable. Today, Edred is one of the lesser-known monarchs of Anglo-Saxon England, overshadowed by the legends of Alfred, Athelstan, and later kings. Yet without Edred's steady hand, England might have fractured once more under Viking rule. His victory over Eric Bloodaxe was not just the end of a rival, it was the end of an era. Edred's story is a reminder that history's heroes are not always the strongest or the most celebrated. Sometimes they are the ones who suffer quietly, who fight battles unseen, and who, through determination alone, keep a kingdom from falling apart. Edred, King of England from 946 to 955, was one such hero. In the long twilight of the Anglo-Saxon age, kings were measured not only by their swords, but by their piety, their alliances, and the unity they could summon from the storm-tossed lands of England. And then came Eadwig the Fair. They said his beauty was unrivaled, his face so striking that poets whispered. He was the fairest man to ever wear the English crown. Yet behind those golden looks lay a reign haunted by scandal, rebellion, and the cruel irony of fate. For in just 4 short years, 955 to 959, Eadwig would rise, rule, and fall, leaving England divided between brother and brother, church and crown, love and loyalty. This is the story of a king who was undone, not by enemies on the battlefield, but by the politics of passion, the wrath of the church, and the ambitions of his own kin. When King Edred, Eadwig's uncle, died in 955, the crown passed to the 15-year-old boy. England was not yet the United Kingdom we know today, but a fragile tapestry of Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, and Northumbria lands bound together only by loyalty to the House of Alfred. The nobles crowned him in a lavish ceremony, but even on his coronation day, rumors spread of the young king's indifference to duty. At the very feast that should have solidified his rule, Eadwig vanished. Bishops and nobles searched for him, only to discover him in his chamber with Echofu, a noble woman, and her daughter Glo-Q in what chroniclers hinted was a scandalous entanglement. This was not simply youthful mischief. It was the spark that would ignite the fury of Dunstan, Abbot of Glastonbury, and one of the most powerful churchmen in England. Dunstan, a stern reformer who believed kings must uphold the sanctity of the church, stormed into Eadwig's chambers during that fateful coronation night. He dragged the young king back to the banquet, humiliating him in front of his nobles. But if Dunstan thought this would make Eadwig more obedient, he was wrong. Instead, the insult festered. Eadwig struck back by stripping Dunstan of his lands and forcing him into exile in Flanders. It was the beginning of a war between crown and church, a struggle that would define his reign. Dunstan's removal shocked the religious establishment. To the reform-minded bishops, Eadwig looked like a reckless boy king, more interested in lust than governance. To his supporters, however, he was asserting royal independence against a church that often tried to dominate kings. At the center of this struggle was Eadwig's marriage to Glyfgi-fu. Glyfgi-fu was no commoner. She was from one of the wealthiest and most influential families in England. Their union should have strengthened his position, but there was a problem. The church declared the marriage invalid, claiming the two were too closely related, likely third cousins or nearer, though exact genealogy remains debated. Dunstan and Archbishop Oda of Canterbury led the charge to annul the marriage, insisting it violated the laws of consanguinity. Some chroniclers suggest they pursued the annulment not purely out of religious zeal, but also out of political calculation. Glyfgi-fu's family's growing influence threatened the balance of power. Eadwig resisted fiercely. He loved Glyfgi and openly defied the church by continuing to live with her. For this, his enemies branded him a sinner and a king unworthy of divine favor. The annulment was finally forced through, and Glyfgi-fu was disgraced, her name forever tied to scandal in the annals of English history. But in breaking his marriage, the church had broken more than the king's heart. They had broken his rule. By 957, just 2 years into Eadwig's reign, his authority was collapsing. The kingdom itself split in two. Eadwig retained Wessex and Kent in the south. His younger brother Edgar, supported by Dunstan and the reformist bishops, was proclaimed king of Mercia and Northumbria in the north. This division was catastrophic. For the first time since Alfred the Great, the fragile unity of England fractured. And yet astonishingly, there was no war. Chroniclers suggest the nobles of the north were simply unwilling to follow Eadwig, believing him too distracted by personal affairs to govern effectively. Edgar, by contrast, had the backing of the church and quickly earned the nickname the Peaceful. Eadwig's reign was reduced to a shadow of what it had once promised. He ruled only the southern heartlands, while his brother gained prestige as the true ruler of the north. Between 957 and 959, Eadwig's position remained weak. His court was riven with factionalism, his support base limited. His reputation as the fair lived on in descriptions of his beauty. but beauty could not hold a kingdom together. In 959, at the age of just 18 or 19, Eadwig died suddenly. The cause is unknown. Some suggest illness, others whisper of foul play, perhaps even poison. With his death, the kingdom passed fully into Edgar's hands, reuniting England once again. Ironically, Eadwig's downfall paved the way for the golden age of Edgar the Peaceful, who strengthened the monarchy, worked with the church, and brought relative stability. History remembered Edgar as one of the greatest Anglo-Saxon kings. Eadwig, in contrast, was remembered as the king who divided the realm and fell victim to his own passions. Edwig's reign lasted only 4 years, but his story remains one of the most dramatic in Anglo-Saxon history. He was the king brought down by love, his marriage to Glyf becoming a national scandal. He was the king who dared to defy Dunstan and the church, but paid the price. He was the king whose rule split England in two, leaving a scar that only his brother could heal. And yet there is something haunting about him. Unlike Edgar, who became the ideal king, Eadwig represents the tragic figure, the youth too bold, too beautiful, and too reckless for the harsh world of medieval politics. As the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle put it, after his death, Edgar became king of all England, and Eadwig ruled no longer. A brief, burning star extinguished before its time. In an age when kings were often measured by the blood they spilled, there came one who ruled not through endless battle, but through the rare and subtle art of peace. His reign was neither weak nor idle, for beneath the still waters of his rule lay strength, wisdom, and an iron grip upon England's fragile unity. This was Edgar, called the Peaceful, 959 to 975, younger brother of the tragic Eadwig the Fair. If Eadwig's short reign was a tale of beauty, scandal, and division, Edgar's was its opposite: stability, prosperity, and quiet triumph. Yet his peace was not the absence of power. It was the product of careful alliances, religious reform, and a calculated balance of force. For 16 years, Edgar steered England into what chroniclers later called a golden age. And though he died young, his legacy became the foundation of English monarchy for centuries to come. Edgar was born around 943, the son of King Edmund I the Magnificent and his queen, Eadwig. He was a child when his father was murdered in 946, and the crown passed to his uncle, King Edred. When Edred died in 955, Edgar's elder brother, Eadwig the Fair, took the throne, leaving Edgar in the shadows. But even in youth, Edgar was different. Where Eadwig was impetuous and passionate, Edgar was reserved and calculating. Chroniclers hint that he was schooled by reform-minded clerics, men who instilled in him discipline, piety, and an understanding of kingship as both sacred duty and political chess. Eadwig's reign quickly collapsed into scandal and division. His conflict with Dunstan, Abbot of Glastonbury, and his disastrous marriage to Glyf fractured the kingdom. By 957, the nobles of Mercia and Northumbria had enough. They rejected Eadwig and turned to Edgar. At just 14 years old, Edgar was proclaimed king in the north, while his brother clung to the south. Yet remarkably, there was no war between them. Instead, England split quietly into two realms, Eadwig ruling Wessex and Kent, Edgar ruling Mercia and Northumbria. The division lasted until 959, when Eadwig died suddenly at the age of 18 or 19. Edgar, still a teenager, became sole ruler of all England. When Edgar took the throne at just 16, he inherited a kingdom weakened by division but not broken. His first act was to recall Dunstan, the exiled abbot who had clashed with Eadwig, and elevate him to Archbishop of Canterbury. This marked the beginning of one of the most important church-crown partnerships in English history. Under Edgar, Dunstan, along with Bishops Oswald and Thelwold, spearheaded the monastic reform movement. Monasteries were rebuilt, stricter rules of discipline enforced, and corruption rooted out. The church became not only a moral authority, but also a political ally, strengthening Edgar's legitimacy. Where his brother Eadwig had fought the church, Edgar embraced it. In doing so, he secured the unwavering support of England's most powerful institution. Edgar's reign was marked by something rare in the 10th century: peace at home and abroad. No Viking invasions shattered his realm. No great rebellions tore it apart. Chroniclers even claimed that merchants and travelers could cross England unarmed, without fear of robbery. Whether legend or fact, it speaks to the security of his reign. But Edgar's peace was not passive. He ruled with firmness. His laws were strict, his justice swift. The king enforced uniform weights and measures across the kingdom, seeking order in trade as much as in governance. He expanded the network of fortified burhs built by his predecessors, ensuring defense was always ready should raiders return. One of Edgar's most remarkable policies was his use of naval power. Each summer he assembled a fleet divided into 3 squadrons that patrolled England's coasts. This was no ceremonial show. This was deterrence in its purest form. Viking fleets had ravaged England for over a century, but under Edgar they did not dare strike. By ruling the waves, Edgar ensured that his title, the Peaceful, was not a mark of weakness, but of dominance. Though Edgar had been king since 959, his most famous coronation took place much later. In 973, at Bath, a symbolic act of renewal and triumph. The ceremony was grander than any before, blending sacred ritual with royal magnificence. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, kings from Scotland, Wales, Strathclyde, and even lesser rulers came to Bath to pledge their submission. Chroniclers tell the tale that Edgar was rowed on the River Dee by 8 tributary kings, a theatrical display of overlordship. Whether fact or embellished legend, it cemented Edgar's image as Lord of all Britain. The coronation liturgy created for Edgar's ceremony was so influential that it shaped English coronations for centuries, echoing even in the crowning of Elizabeth II in 1953. Though pious in reputation, Edgar's personal life was tangled. He had multiple wives and mistresses fathering children who would later divide the realm. By his first wife, Thelwold, often called the White Duck, he had Edward, later known as Edward the Martyr. By his second wife, Wulfthryth, he fathered Edith of Wilton, who became a saint. His third marriage to Galfrith produced Ethelred, later called the Unready. These rival lines of succession would haunt England after Edgar's death. For though his reign was peaceful, the seeds of conflict lay in the competing claims of his sons. Edgar died unexpectedly in 975 at the age of about 32. The cause is unknown. Some suggest illness. Others whisper of divine judgment. He was buried at Glastonbury, where Dunstan had once ruled as abbot. His death unleashed the very storms his reign had held back. A succession crisis followed, as nobles and churchmen argued between his elder son, Edward, and his younger son, Ethelred. The peace Edgar built crumbled swiftly, leading to bloodshed, betrayal, and the eventual Viking invasions that returned with fury under Ethelred's ill-starred rule. History remembers Edgar as the peaceful, but his peace was neither passive nor accidental. It was the result of careful statecraft, stern justice, naval strength, and a powerful alliance with the Church. His reign represents one of the high points of Anglo-Saxon England, an interlude of stability between the turmoil of his predecessors and the disasters of his successors. He shaped coronation traditions, strengthened the Church, secured the realm, and expanded England's influence across Britain. Yet perhaps because his rule was not marked by dramatic wars or scandal, his name is less remembered than Alfred the Great or Athelstan. And yet his reign was the hinge upon which the destiny of England turned. Edgar's story is one of quiet brilliance. Where others sought glory in war, he found it in peace. Where others defied the Church, he bound it to his throne. Where others fractured the kingdom, he united it. His life was brief, but his model of kingship endured. Centuries later, when English monarchs were crowned, they echoed the liturgy first written for Edgar, his name carved into chronicles, whispered through abbeys, remains a reminder that not all greatness comes from the sword. Edgar the Peaceful was not merely a king who avoided war. He was a king who mastered the art of ruling so well that war was unnecessary. And that, perhaps, is the rarest triumph of all. In the mists of 10th century England, when the crown was as perilous as it was precious, there rose a boy king whose reign flickered like a candle in the storm. His name was Edward, son of Edgar the Peaceful, heir to Alfred the Great, and remembered forever not for conquests or laws, but for a death so shocking, so soaked in betrayal, that the people of England named him not merely king, but martyr. His reign lasted just 3 short years, 975-978. Yet in that brief span, Edward's life became a saga of family rivalries, political treachery, churchly intrigue, and the shadow of a murder that would shape the destiny of England itself. This is not the tale of a victorious conqueror. It is the tale of a boy who ruled too young, trusted too much, and whose blood at Corfe Castle would mark the crown with tragedy. Edward was born the eldest son of King Edgar, 959 to 975, one of the greatest rulers of the Anglo-Saxon age. Edgar's reign was known as a golden time of unity and stability. He had bound England together, worked in harmony with the reforming Church, and was hailed as a king whose authority stretched from the Channel to the Scots. But Edgar's personal life was far less peaceful. He had several wives and concubines, and from these unions came rival sons, Edward the elder and Ethelred the younger, born to Edgar's second wife, Glothrith. This split bloodline would prove fatal, for when Edgar the Peaceful died unexpectedly in 975 at only about 32 years old, the crown passed not to a seasoned ruler, but to his boy son Edward, just 12 or 13 years of age. From the very start, Edward's kingship was contested. 2 factions formed: Edward's party, led by Archbishop Dunstan of Canterbury, the towering churchman who had guided kings since Athelstan, and who believed Edward, though young, was the rightful heir. Ethelred's party, led by Queen Glothrith, the boy's ambitious mother, who claimed the crown for her younger son. The nobility split. The Church itself divided. Some magnates saw in Edward a weak child they could manipulate. Others feared his fiery temper. and still others, siding with Ethelred, whispered that Edward's legitimacy was questionable, his birth shadowed by scandal. But Dunstan, the iron-willed archbishop, stood before the Witan, the king's council, and thundered that Edward, son of Edgar, was the true king. Owing to his authority, the nobles agreed reluctantly. Thus the boy was crowned, though his crown rested uneasily on his head. Edward was no idle child. Contemporary sources paint him as quick, intelligent, and passionate. But he was also impetuous, prone to bursts of anger, and unskilled in the arts of compromise. He inherited a kingdom on edge. Edgar had favored monastic reform, granting lands and privileges to abbeys and monks. But many powerful nobles resented this, having lost lands to the church. Now, with Edgar dead and a boy on the throne, these disgruntled lords struck back. Civil unrest spread. Monasteries were attacked, lands seized, monks expelled. Chroniclers describe it as a time of great turmoil, with the king's writ barely obeyed beyond his court. Edward, still so young, was caught between the fiery zeal of Dunstan and the grasping ambitions of the nobility. And always behind the shadows was Glothrith, the stepmother who schemed for her own son Ethelred. Glothrith, Edward's stepmother, was no ordinary queen. Chroniclers portray her as one of the most ambitious and ruthless women of the age. Some even likened her to the scheming queens of legend, whispering that she would stop at nothing to see her son crowned. Her weapon was patience. While Edward alienated nobles with his youthful arrogance, Glothrith quietly won allies. She spread whispers that Edward was cruel, unfit to rule, that his rashness endangered England itself. Meanwhile, Ethelred, just a child himself, was styled the more gentle brother. The kingdom split into factions. It was not open war, but a cold civil conflict, smoldering in courts and councils, with each side waiting for its moment. That moment came in March 978. Edward was riding near Corfe Castle, where Queen Glothrith resided with young Ethelred. The king, then only about 16, stopped to visit his stepmother and half-brother. It was meant to be a friendly call, the boy king unguarded, perhaps seeking reconciliation, but treachery awaited. As he dismounted his horse, Edward was offered a cup of wine. Then, struck suddenly, perhaps stabbed, perhaps seized, he was attacked by retainers loyal to the queen. The boy reeled, wounded. His horse bolted, dragging him as he clutched the saddle, his lifeblood spilling into the earth. The King of England, betrayed in the home of his stepmother, died without aid. He was just 16 years old. The chroniclers do not agree on details. Some claim Glothrith orchestrated it. Others leave it to dark suggestion. But all agree Edward was murdered, and Ethelred, the younger brother, became king. The murder horrified England. The people, even those who had doubted Edward, were outraged. A king, murdered not in battle, but through treachery, at his own family's hearth. Such an act was beyond forgiveness. The boy's body was hastily buried at Wareham, but miracles were soon reported at his grave. The common folk began to venerate him as a holy martyr, a king slain unjustly, innocent in the eyes of God. Within a generation, he was canonized as St. Edward the Martyr. His remains were moved to Shaftesbury Abbey, where pilgrims flocked, and his cult spread across England. Even kings who followed revered his memory, lest they too fall under God's judgment. Edward's murder cleared the way for Ethelred, known to history as Ethelred the Unready, unread, meaning ill-advised. His reign 978-1016 would be one of the darkest in English history, plagued by Viking invasions, disastrous policies, and endless bloodshed. In hindsight, Edward's death was not only a tragedy, it was a catastrophe for England. The boy king, impetuous though he was, might have matured into a strong ruler like his grandfather Edgar. Instead, his murder condemned England to decades of chaos. And so, in death, Edward's image grew brighter. He was remembered as pure, innocent, and wronged, a boy martyr whose blood cried out against treachery, while his brother's long reign became a cautionary tale of ruin. Edward ruled for only 3 years. He passed no great laws, won no great battles, built no mighty monuments. Yet his story endures as one of the most dramatic in Anglo-Saxon history. He was the boy king caught in a web of ambition. He was the victim of his stepmother's schemes. He was the martyr whose cult rivaled even great saints. And though he reigned but briefly, his death shaped England's fate. His blood at Corfe Castle was the spark that lit the fire of Ethelred's disastrous reign, leading ultimately to Viking conquest and the fall of the House of Alfred. Edward's tragedy was not only personal, it was national. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records Edward's reign in only a few lines, yet those lines echo with sorrow. And in this year was King Edward killed at Corfe, and his body was first buried at Wareham. And afterwards it was carried to Shaftesbury, and miracles were wrought there. A boy crowned in uncertainty, slain in treachery, remembered in sanctity. Edward the Martyr's reign was as brief as a candle flame flickering, fragile, yet in its very extinguishing, casting a light that has endured for more than 1,000 years. In the age when the sons of Alfred the Great still clung to the dream of a united England, when Viking longships lurked on the horizons like wolves stalking sheep, there rose a king whose story would be told not in triumph, but in failure. They called him Ethelred the Unready, but not because he was lazy, nor because he was unprepared in the way we might think today. His Old English epithet was unrid, meaning ill-advised. He was a king guided by bad counsel, cursed by fate, and plagued by enemies who struck like thunder from the sea. For 37 years, 979-1013, then again 1014 to 1016, Ethelred would wear the crown of England. Yet his reign was not one of glory, but of blood, betrayal, and ruin. His was the reign that saw England ransacked by Viking armies, its churches burned, its people slaughtered, its silver drained in desperate bribes called darkened. His was the reign that paved the way for the coming of the Danish kings and the end of Anglo-Saxon England as it had been known. And yet his story is more than just a tale of disaster. It is a tragedy, a human drama of a boy crowned too young, haunted by a bloody prophecy, and left to rule a kingdom already trembling under the weight of destiny. This is the saga of Ethelred II, the unready a king, fated to fail. Ethelred's rise to power was soaked in blood. His half-brother, Edward the Martyr, had been brutally murdered in 978 at Corfe Castle. Edward, still young, was stabbed while visiting his stepmother, Queen Glothrith, Laured's mother. Whispers spread that Glothrith herself had plotted the murder to place her own son, Ethelred, on the throne. Chroniclers, writing decades later, claimed the boy king could never wash the blood from his crown. He ascended the throne in 979 at just 12 years old, crowned at Kingston upon Thames. From the start, his reign was cursed with suspicion. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle thundered with ominous words. In this king's days nothing prospered, neither the realm nor the people, but they were continually harassed with raids and burnings. Was it the stain of fratricide or simply ill-fated fortune? Whatever the cause, England's darkest age had begun. For nearly 80 years, England had known relative peace since Alfred the Great had defeated Guthrum and the Danelaw had been absorbed into a single kingdom. But under Ethelred, the Viking terror returned in full force. 980's raids. In 980, just 1 year after Ethelred's coronation, Viking raiders struck Dorset, Thanet, and Hampshire. London was burned in 982, the Great Invasion of 991. By the 990s, fleets larger than anything Alfred had faced descended upon England. At Malden in 991, Earl Byrhtnoth led the English against a massive Viking host. In one of the most famous battles in Anglo-Saxon history, Byrhtnoth fell and the Vikings triumphed. The defeat was immortalized in the Old English poem, The Battle of Malden, celebrating English heroism even in loss. After Malden, Ethelred made a fateful choice. Instead of resisting, he paid tribute, what became known as Danegeld. He gave the Vikings 10,000 pounds of silver to leave England in peace. But peace never came. Again and again, Ethelred turned to bribery. 991, 10,000 pounds. 994, 16,000 pounds. 1002, 24,000 pounds. 1007, 36,000 pounds. 1012, a staggering 48,000 pounds. Each payment bankrupted the kingdom, drained the people, and emboldened the raiders. The Vikings learned that England was rich, weak, and willing to buy survival. They came back each time, larger and hungrier. Worse still, some Viking leaders like Olaf Tryggvason of Norway and Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark used England's wealth to fund their own ascents to royal power abroad. Ethelred was, in effect, paying for the rise of the very kings who would one day seek his throne. In 1002, Ethelred sought to secure peace through marriage. He wed Emma of Normandy, sister of Duke Richard II of Normandy. This was meant to forge an alliance that would prevent Vikings from using Normandy as a base to attack England. But that same year, Ethelred made one of the most infamous decisions of his reign. On St. Brice's Day, the 13th of November 1002, he ordered the massacre of all Danes living in England. It was a desperate attempt to rid his realm of Viking spies and settlers, but it was a slaughter. Men, women, and children were butchered in the streets. In Oxford, a group of Danes who sought refuge in St. Friedwide's Church were burned alive when the church was set aflame. Among the dead was, it is said, Gunhild, the sister of Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark. This act turned the full wrath of Denmark upon England. Sweyn vowed vengeance, and from that moment on, England became his prize. For the next decade, England bled. Viking armies ravaged the land, churches were looted, towns burned. Leored's commanders often betrayed him. Some joined the enemy. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle lamented, "Never was there a more harried king than Ethelred." By 1013, Sweyn Forkbeard himself invaded with the largest fleet yet. Town after town submitted. London alone resisted. But even there, support wavered. By Christmas 1013, the English nobility abandoned Ethelred. Sweyn Forkbeard was declared King of England, the first Danish king to sit on the throne. Ethelred fled across the Channel with Queen Emma and his sons, seeking refuge in Normandy. The once proud kingdom of Alfred lay broken. But fate had one last twist. Sweyn Forkbeard died suddenly in February 1014 after ruling England for only 5 weeks. His death left a power vacuum. The English nobles, desperate to preserve their independence, invited Ethelred back on one condition. He must rule better than before, take counsel from his lords, and abandon the ill advice that had cursed his reign. Ethelred agreed. He returned to England and was restored as king, but his enemies were not gone. Sweyn's son, Canute the Great, soon arrived to press his claim. The final 2 years of Ethelred's reign were filled with war. Canute ravaged the south, while Ethelred, old and sick, struggled to rally resistance. His sons, most notably Edmund Ironside, took the fight into their own hands. In 1016, with London under siege and the kingdom in flames, Ethelred died on the 23rd of April 1016. He had reigned for 37 years, the longest of any Anglo-Saxon king up to that point, but his reign had been a litany of defeats. His son, Edmund Ironside, inherited the crown and tried valiantly to resist Canute, but within months England would fall into Danish hands. The dynasty of Alfred the Great had come to its twilight. History has not been kind to Ethelred. To this day he is remembered as the unready, the king who failed. Yet his tragedy is deeper than simple incompetence. He inherited a kingdom fractured by suspicion, crowned in fratricide, and beset by enemies more powerful than any his forebears had faced. He was no Alfred the Great, no warrior king like his son Edmund. He relied too often on counsel, and too often that counsel failed him. Still, beneath the shadow of failure, Ethelred left behind important legacies. His marriage to Emma of Normandy would shape the future of England. Through her, the Norman dukes gained their claim to the English throne, leading directly to the Norman conquest of 1066. His struggles against the Vikings paved the way for his son Edmund Ironside, and later Canute the Great, forging a new Anglo-Danish empire. But in the end, Ethelred was the king who watched England burn, the king who paid silver to his enemies, the king who fled when his people needed him most. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicles' words remain his epitaph. In his days, nothing went right. Ethelred, the unready England's doomed king, remembered not for what he built, but for what he lost. On a wind-torn hill in October of 1066, as arrows rained like iron hail, and the clash of Norman steel echoed across the fields of Hastings, a king fought with the fury of a lion cornered in his den. His name was Harold Godwinson, the last crowned Anglo-Saxon king of England. To some he was a usurper, snatching a throne that had been promised to another. To others he was the greatest warrior of his age, a man whose courage was carved into the very soil of England. His reign was brief, just 9 months, but his death marked the twilight of Anglo-Saxon England, the end of an age, and the beginning of a Norman dawn. This is not just the story of a king. It is the saga of loyalty and betrayal, oaths and ambition, blood spilled on foreign shores and English soil alike. Harold's fate was written in the stars long before Hastings, yet he met it with unyielding defiance. Harold was born around 1022, the son of Godwin, Earl of Wessex, one of the most powerful men in England under King Canute, and later Edward the Confessor. His mother, Gytha, was a Danish noblewoman niece of Canute, himself giving Harold both English and Scandinavian blood in his veins. The Godwin family was vast and ambitious. Harold's brothers included Tostig, the tempestuous Earl of Northumbria, Gyrth, Leofwine, and Wulfnoth. Together they controlled vast swaths of land, wealth, and power, rivaling even the crown itself. When Edward the Confessor, a pious and childless king, ruled England, the question of succession loomed like a storm cloud. Harold, rising to prominence as Earl of Wessex after his father's death in 1053, was the strongest candidate. He was handsome, charismatic, and above all, a proven warrior and statesman. By the 1060s, Harold was more than just Edward's leading earl. He was England's de facto ruler. He led armies against the Welsh, crushing Gruffydd ap Llywelyn in 1063, bringing Wales under English dominance. He negotiated with nobles, brokered peace, and stood as the kingdom's protector. But across the sea in Normandy, another man watched and waited: William, Duke of Normandy. One of the most hotly debated moments in Harold's life came in 1064. Sailing across the Channel, perhaps on a diplomatic mission, perhaps by storm and accident, Harold landed in Normandy. There he became the guest of Duke William. William later claimed that during this visit Harold swore an oath on holy relics, pledging to support William's claim to the English throne after Edward's death. Some say Harold was coerced, others that he never truly meant it. Yet in medieval thought, to swear on relics was to bind one's very soul. Whether oath or fabrication, William would wield it as a weapon, declaring Harold a perjurer when he later took the throne. On January 5, 1066, King Edward died. With no children, the succession crisis exploded. 3 men claimed the throne. 1. Harold Godwinson, chosen by the English nobles, the Witan, and crowned the very next day. 2. William of Normandy, who declared Harold had sworn to support his right. 3. Harold Hardrada, King of Norway, who based his claim on old treaties and the legacy of the Vikings. Harold was crowned swiftly in Westminster Abbey on January 6, 1066. For the English, this was lawful and right. The Witan had spoken, the sacred anointing completed. For William and Hardrada, it was theft. Thus began a year of storms, invasions, and destiny. In September 1066, while Harold kept his eyes southward for William's Norman fleet, the Viking thunder came from the north. Harold Hardrada, a towering warrior king, sailed with perhaps 10,000 men, joined by Harold's own estranged brother, Tostig Godwinson. The invaders crushed an English force at Fulford near York. England trembled, but Harold moved with lightning speed. Gathering his housecarls in the Fyrd, he marched nearly 200 miles north in less than 2 weeks. At Stamford Bridge on September 25, 1066, he struck. The battle was ferocious. Hardrada, legendary for his exploits across Europe, fell with an arrow to the throat. Tostig too was slain, his rebellion ending in blood. Of the vast Viking host, only a handful survived, limping back to Norway in scattered ships. England rejoiced. Harold had saved the kingdom. Yet fate was cruel. Just as he claimed victory in the north, news came that William had landed in the south. William's fleet had arrived at Pevensey on September 28, 1066. He burned villages, built castles, and dared Harold to face him. Exhausted from Stamford Bridge, Harold nonetheless raced south. On October 14, 1066, the 2 armies met at Senlac Hill near Hastings. The English shield wall stood strong, a wall of iron and wood. All day, Norman cavalry and archers hurled themselves at it, breaking like waves against a cliff. At times the Normans feigned retreat, luring parts of Harold's army down the hill, cutting them to pieces. As the sun dipped low, the shield wall began to waver. Then came the fatal moment. An arrow, perhaps loosed by chance, struck Harold in the eye. Norman knights surged forward and Harold fell, cut down where he stood, surrounded by his loyal housecarls. The last Anglo-Saxon king was dead. With Harold's death, resistance collapsed. William marched on London, crowned king on Christmas Day, 1066. The Norman conquest had begun, reshaping England's language, laws, and lords. But Harold did not vanish from memory. To some chroniclers, he was a usurper who broke his oath. To others, he was England's lion who defended his land against invaders from both north and south, dying as the last defender of Anglo-Saxon freedom. Harold II's reign lasted only 9 months, but his story burns eternal. He was the last crowned Anglo-Saxon king of England, the victor of Stamford Bridge, who crushed the Viking threat, the fallen hero of Hastings, whose death marked the end of an age. In Harold, we see the tragedy of a man caught between oaths and crowns, family and foes, God and fate. His body may have been cut down on Hastings Field, but his saga endures as the last great chapter of Anglo-Saxon England. As the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mournfully wrote after Hastings, "Here Harold, king of the English, fell, and with him England's glory. In the year of our Lord 1016, England trembled on the edge of ruin. Viking warlords circled like wolves, kingdoms splintered under the weight of betrayal, and the throne itself was contested by sword and blood. And in the midst of this storm stood a man of unbreakable will. They called him Ironside, not for his birth or his lineage, but for his indomitable spirit and unyielding courage. He was Edmund II, son of Ethelred the Unready, the king who had fled before the Danes. Where his father bent and faltered, Edmund refused to bow. His reign lasted barely 7 months, yet in that brief blaze he fought more battles than many kings in a lifetime. His saga is one of iron, blood, betrayal, and the cruel twist of fate that left him England's tragic champion. Edmund was born around 990, the third son of Ethelred II, the Unready and Gloggifu of York. His father's reign was cursed with disaster Viking raids. Burned across the land, the infamous St. Brice's Day massacre of 1002 brought only vengeance, and the great Danish king Sweyn Forkward seized the English throne in 1013. Ethelred fled to Normandy with his family, branded unrid, poorly advised, weak, a king who could not defend his own people. Yet while Ethelred faltered, his son Edmund grew into a man of opposite character. Strong, fierce, and unafraid of battle, he earned the loyalty of warriors who despaired of his father's failures. In 1015, when the Danish prince Canute returned to England with a vast fleet, the kingdom fell into chaos. Nobles betrayed their oaths, whole regions submitted to the Danes, and Ethelred, by then sickly and broken, could do little to resist. Edmund, however, was not idle. In defiance of his father and the Witan, he married Eadwig, widow of Sigefirth, a powerful thane of the Midlands who had been treacherously killed. By this union, Edmund gained the allegiance of the 5 boroughs of the Danelaw-Mercia, warlike towns that had long teetered between Dane and Saxon. It was a scandal. The marriage may have been against church law, for Eadwig had been placed under royal custody after her husband's death. But for Edmund, politics and survival outweighed piety. He needed allies, and he would take them by sword or by bed. On April 23, 1016, King Ethelred died. To some, his passing was a Mercian end to a reign remembered only for defeat, but his death left a vacuum. In London, the citizens and the Witan chose Edmund as king. He was young, untested as a ruler, but he had the courage his father lacked. Meanwhile, Canute was proclaimed king by the Danes and their English collaborators. Thus began a brutal contest for England's crown. Canute the Conqueror versus Edmund Ironside. The summer and autumn of 1016 were filled with near-constant warfare, as Edmund fought Canute across England. Chroniclers describe 5 great battles, each testing Edmund's resolve. 1. Battle of Pencilwood, Somerset, early 1016. Edmund rallied men in the west and struck at Canute's forces. The battle was indecisive, but it showed England that the young king would fight. 2. Battle of Shurston, Wiltshire, summer 1016. Here, Edmund displayed his ferocity. The clash lasted 2 days, with immense slaughter on both sides. Though inconclusive, it proved Edmund could stand toe-to-toe with the mighty Danish host. 3. Battle of Brentford, Middlesex, summer 1016. Edmund struck boldly at Danish forces near London, achieving a rare victory. But his army suffered heavy losses in the pursuit, weakening his strength for what was to come. 4. Battle of Otford, Kent, autumn 1016. Once again, Edmund led his men with valor, pushing the Danes back. London, which had resisted siege after siege, held firm under his banner. 5. The final battle, Hastings, Essex, October 18, 1016. This was the decisive clash. Edmund's men fought with fury, but treachery undid them. Edred, the notorious turncoat alderman of Mercia, betrayed the king, withdrawing his forces at the height of battle. The English shield wall broke, and the Danes claimed victory. Hastings was a disaster. England lay open to the Danes, yet even then Edmund would not yield. After Hastings, Canute might have pressed his advantage and crushed Edmund entirely. But the young king's spirit and the loyalty of Londoners impressed even the conqueror. Instead of total conquest, the 2 men met at Olney, or Alney, near Deerhurst. There they forged a treaty. England would be divided. Edmund kept Wessex, the heartland of Alfred the Great. Canute took Mercia and Northumbria. At the death of either, the survivor would rule all England. It was a compromise born of exhaustion, yet it also seemed to promise peace. But fate was crueler still. On November 30th, 1016, scarcely 6 weeks after Hastings, Edmund Ironside was dead. He was only in his mid-20s. The cause remains a mystery, cloaked in rumor. Some say illness struck him down. Others whisper of assassination. One tale claims he was stabbed by a hidden blade while using the privy, a deed perhaps ordered by Canute himself or by the ever-treacherous Edred. With Edmund gone, Canute became king of all England, ushering in nearly 2 decades of Danish rule. Edmund's reign was short April to November 1016, but his legacy was carved in iron. He fought 5 great battles in defense of his realm, never cowering as his father had done. He preserved English pride at a time when all seemed lost, earning the name Ironside from friend and foe alike. His sons, Edward and Edmund, were exiled, but later carried his bloodline abroad. In time, through marriage and lineage, Edmund's descendants would mingle with those of the Normans and return to the English throne generations later. Had he lived longer, perhaps England would have remained Anglo-Saxon. Perhaps conquest would have faltered, but history remembers him not for what might have been, but for the iron will he displayed in the face of impossible odds. Edmund II Ironside was the last true warrior king of the House of Wessex. His life was brief, his reign shorter still, but his defiance became legend. As the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle declared with quiet awe, he fought 5 battles against the Danes with his own hand, and he was always the victor until they betrayed him. A king of iron, broken only by death. History remembers kings and conquerors, but sometimes the greatest dramas belong to those who never wore the crown. Edward, son of Edmund Ironside, was born into fire and exile. He was the last true heir of Alfred the Great's line, a prince who should have grown to reclaim his father's legacy. But fate denied him. Torn from England as a child, raised in distant courts, he lived his life as a wanderer, a shadow king whose destiny always lingered just beyond his grasp. When at last he was called home after 40 years in exile, the crown seemed almost within reach. Yet within days of setting foot on English soil, Edward the exile was dead. Some whispered poison, others fate, but all agree his was a story of promise broken, of a dynasty that slipped through history's fingers. This is the tale of Edward the Exile, the king England almost had, but never knew. Edward was born around 1016, the son of King Edmund II Ironside, the warrior king who had fought 5 battles against Count the Dane. But Edmund's reign was short, barely 7 months before he died, likely murdered. In November 1016, Edward was an infant, his brother Edmund even younger. They were the last hope of the House of Wessex. But in that year, England was already lost. Canute, victorious at Hastings, claimed the throne. The fate of the baby princes was sealed by politics. Canute could not allow rivals to grow into men. Some sources say he ordered them killed, but instead, the boys were spared thanks to an oath or the intervention of nobles and sent abroad. Exile, not death, would be their destiny. Thus Edward, before he could even walk, was torn from his father's kingdom and cast adrift into the storm of Europe. The 2 boys were first sent to the court of Olaf Skekkonung, king of Sweden. Perhaps Canute hoped they would quietly disappear there, or that their claim would wither in obscurity. But the Swedish king, unwilling to shed innocent blood, passed them on to safety. From Sweden, the exiled princes traveled eastward. Some chronicles place them in Kiev and Rus, under the protection of Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise, a powerful ruler who often sheltered displaced royals from across Europe. Eventually, Edward found his long-term home in Hungary, at the court of King Stephen I and later his successors. There, in the heart of Central Europe, Edward grew into manhood far from the land he was born to rule. His youth was shaped not by English halls and Anglo-Saxon customs, but by the mix of Slavic, Hungarian, and Byzantine influences. He became a European prince, a man of languages, diplomacy, and foreign courts. Yet within him always burned the knowledge that he was the son of a king, and that England, his birthright, was lost. In Hungary, Edward married a noblewoman named Agatha, whose origins remain a mystery debated by historians. Some claim she was kin to the German imperial family. Others say she was related to the princes of Kiev and Rus. Whoever she was, she brought Edward both status and children. They had 3 known offspring: Margaret, later St. Margaret of Scotland, who would marry Malcolm III of Scotland, and become the revered mother of Scottish kings, Christina, who became a nun in England, Edgar Theling, Edward's only son, who would one day be named King of England, though never crowned. Thus, even in exile, the bloodline of Alfred the Great endured, spreading its roots into Scotland and beyond. While Edward lived his life abroad, England's fate twisted and turned. Canute ruled until 1035, then his sons Harold Harefoot and Harthacnut reigned briefly, both dying without heirs. Finally, in 1042, the throne returned to the House of Wessex through Edward the Confessor, son of Ethelred the Unready and half-brother to Edward the Exile's father. But Edward the Confessor was childless. As the years passed, it became clear that England faced a looming succession crisis. Who would inherit the throne when the Confessor died? The obvious choice was Edward the Exile, rightful heir as the son of Edmund Ironside. By blood, no one had a stronger claim, and so after 4 decades abroad, the exiled prince was summoned home. In 1057, Edward the Exile finally returned to England. Imagine the scene, the long-lost prince stepping ashore, the last living son of Ironside, his very presence a reminder of a dynasty thought lost. For the English people, weary of Danish and Norman influence, it must have felt like a chance for renewal. But fate is merciless. Within days, perhaps weeks of his arrival, Edward was dead. The cause is uncertain. Some chronicles suggest natural illness, others whisper treachery. Many point to Harold Godwinson, the powerful earl who stood closest to the throne, as having motive to remove the rival claimant. Whether by poison or sudden sickness, Edward's life was cut short before he could even meet the king or be formally recognized. He had survived exile, foreign courts, and 40 years in waiting only to die on the threshold of destiny. Edward never wore the crown, but his bloodline shaped the future of Britain. His daughter Margaret became Queen of Scotland, Mother of Kings, and was canonized as a saint. Through her, the English royal bloodline mingled with the Scottish, eventually returning to the English throne centuries later. His son Edgar Theling was chosen king by the Witan after the death of Harold at Hastings in 1066. Though never crowned, Edgar remained the symbol of Anglo-Saxon resistance against William the Conqueror. Thus Edward, the forgotten prince, was the father of saints and would-be kings. His life, though seemingly wasted in exile, became the bridge between the old dynasty of Alfred the Great and the future dynasties that ruled after the Norman conquest. Edward's story is one of the most poignant in Anglo-Saxon history. He was born a king's son but grew up as a refugee. He was the rightful heir, but lived as a stranger in foreign lands. He was called home at last, but died before his time. His epithet, the exile, is both his curse and his legacy. Unlike his father, Ironside, who died in battle, or his cousin, the Confessor, who ruled in peace, Edward lived in the shadows, remembered not for what he did, but for what might have been. And yet, through his children, his blood endured. Though Edward never sat on the throne, the pulse of his line flowed on through Scotland, through saints, through the dream of a crown lost and never regained. Edward the Exile, the king England almost had. They called him the Confessor, a king who preferred prayer to war, fasting to feasting, the cloister's silence to the clamor of the battlefield. In an age of swords and blood, Edward stood apart, a man of faith who would rather bend his knees before the altar than brandish a blade. Yet behind the saintly image lay a reign shaped by politics as ruthless as any battle. For Edward's piety could not shield him from the ambitions of earls, the schemes of Normans, or the curse that haunted his house, the failure to produce an heir. From 1042 to 1066, Edward ruled as the last true king of Alfred the Great's line. His reign glittered with peace, prosperity, and devotion, but beneath the surface, the ground trembled. When Edward died, his failure to secure England's succession unleashed the most famous conquest in English history. This is the story of Edward the Confessor, the saint, the ruler, the man whose holiness could not save his kingdom. Edward was born around 1003, the son of Ethelred the Unready and Emma of Normandy. His childhood was a time of terror. Viking raids ravaged England, and in 1013 the great Danish conqueror Sweyn Forkbeard drove the royal family into exile. Young Edward fled across the sea to Normandy, the land of his mother's kin. There, amid Norman castles and churches, he grew up in exile. He would spend nearly 25 years abroad, watching as England fell under the rule of Canute and his sons. It was in Normandy that Edward became the man the world would know, fluent in French, shaped by Norman culture, deeply pious, and forever marked by a sense of being an outsider to the land of his birth. Fortune shifted in 1042. Canute's sons were dead, and the English crown returned to the old royal line through Edward's half-brother, Harthacnut. When Harthacnut died, suddenly collapsing at a wedding feast, Edward was chosen as king. At nearly 40 years old, Edward ascended a throne he had not seen since childhood. His coronation at Winchester was filled with hope, the return of the House of Wessex after decades of Danish rule. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the joy of the people who longed for peace after years of war. But Edward was not the warrior king his ancestors had been. He was gentle, devout, cautious. His reign would be shaped not by swords, but by politics, alliances, and the quiet power of the church. Edward earned his epithet, the Confessor, for his extraordinary devotion. He fasted, prayed, gave alms generously, and was said to cure the sick with his touch. Chroniclers describe him as a man with snow-white hair and a ruddy face, gentle in speech, humble in spirit. His greatest legacy of piety was Westminster Abbey. Edward ordered the building of a vast stone church in the Romanesque style, unlike anything seen before in England. It became his life's project, a symbol of his faith in the place where he would be buried. To this day, Westminster Abbey stands as the shrine of Edward the Confessor, the Saint King of England. Yet holiness could not rule a kingdom, and in the halls of power, others moved the pieces of the chessboard. If Edward prayed, Earl Godwin of Wessex ruled. Godwin was the most powerful nobleman in England, controlling vast lands and commanding the loyalty of warriors. To secure his throne, Edward married Godwin's daughter, Edith, in 1045, but the marriage was loveless, perhaps even unconsummated. Edward, shaped by years in exile and inclined to chastity, kept Edith at arm's length. To her father, this was both an insult and a danger. If Edward had no heirs, the succession would one day be up for grabs. Tensions soon boiled over. In 1051, a quarrel erupted between Edward and Godwin over Norman influence at court. Edward, favoring his Norman friends, clashed with Godwin, who represented the old English nobility. The conflict came to a head when Godwin refused to punish his men for killing a Norman, leading to open hostility. Edward struck back with royal authority, banishing Godwin and his family. For a brief moment, Edward seemed free of the Godwins, and he filled his court with Norman advisors, cementing his image as an outsider king. But the triumph was short-lived. The next year, the Godwins returned with an army, and the nobles of England sided with them. Edward had no choice but to restore them to power. From then on, the Godwin family, especially Godwin's ambitious son, Harold, would dominate England. Edward's long exile in Normandy had left its mark. He favored Norman churchmen, Norman customs, even Norman advisors. This foreign influence stirred resentment among the English nobility, but it also sowed the seeds of a future conquest. Chroniclers claim that around 1051, Edward, perhaps disillusioned with the Godwins, promised the English crown to his cousin, Duke William of Normandy. William would never forget this promise. Whether Edward truly intended it or not, the moment bound England's fate to Normandy. Edward's reign was peaceful compared to the stormy decades before, but one issue haunted him. He had no heir. His marriage to Edith produced no children. Whether this was Edward's choice, a vow of chastity, as some later claimed, or simply misfortune, it left England facing a dangerous vacuum. The only direct heir was Edward the Exile, son of Edmund Ironside. In 1057, Edward recalled him from Hungary, only for the prince to die within days of arriving in England. Suspicion lingers that Harold Godwinson or others had a hand in it. This left Edward the Exile's young son, Edgar Feeling, as heir in blood. But Edgar was a child, inexperienced, and lacked support. The Godwins, meanwhile, grew ever stronger, with Harold rising to become the most powerful man in the kingdom. By the early 1060s, it was clear, when Edward died, the succession would be contested. In his last years, Edward withdrew more and more into religion, leaving much of the realm's governance to Harold Godwinson. He focused on completing Westminster Abbey, which was consecrated in December 1065, just days before Edward's death. On January 5, 1066, Edward died in his bedchamber at Westminster. He was buried the next day in the great abbey he had built, his body laid to rest before the high altar. Within a century, miracles were attributed to him, and in 1161 he was canonized as a saint. But on the very day after his death, Harold Godwinson was crowned king. Edward's failure to secure the succession had left a dangerous void, and within months, England would be invaded by both Harold Hardrada of Norway and William of Normandy. Edward the Confessor is remembered as the last king of Alfred the Great's dynasty, the last Anglo-Saxon monarch before the Norman conquest. He ruled for 24 years of relative peace, his reign marked not by conquest, but by prosperity and faith. His sainthood, recognized by the Church, made him one of the most revered English monarchs of the Middle Ages. To this day, his shrine at Westminster remains a place of pilgrimage. Yet Edward's legacy is double-edged. His holiness won him a crown in heaven, but his indecision and failure to secure an heir doomed his crown on earth. By leaving the throne disputed between Harold, William, and Edgar Feeling, he set in motion the catastrophe of 1066, the year that changed England forever. Edward the Confessor, the saintly king, the builder of Westminster, the last light of Anglo-Saxon England, whose prayers could not save his kingdom from the storm that followed. In the dying embers of the Anglo-Saxon age, when England trembled between Viking storms and Norman shadows, there lived a queen whose name was whispered not for her beauty, but for her power. Edith of Wessex, sister to a conqueror, wife to a saint, and daughter of the most ambitious Earl England ever knew, was a woman born in the eye of destiny's storm. She was queen to Edward the Confessor, but her true story is far greater than any crown she wore. She was the last great Anglo-Saxon queen, a witness to the twilight of her people, the sister of the fallen Harold Godwinson, and the silent observer of England's final breath before the Norman dawn. This is her saga, the story of love, exile, betrayal, and survival in an age where queens were pawns. Yet Edith of Wessex played like a queen. To understand Edith, one must first know the House of Godwin, the mightiest dynasty in pre-Norman England. Her father, Godwin, Earl of Wessex, was no noble by birth. He rose from the ranks of thanes, a self-made man who became the right hand of King Canute the Great, the Danish conqueror, who ruled both England and Denmark. Godwin's cunning, loyalty, and political brilliance made him indispensable, and soon he held more power than the king's own blood. Edith was born into this furnace of ambition sometime around 1025, in a world ruled by men but quietly shaped by women like her. Her brothers were many and formidable: Sweyn, Tostig, Gyrth, Leofwine, and Harold, each destined to wield power or die for it. From childhood, Edith was groomed not merely to marry well, but to become a queen. Her education was exceptional for a woman of her time. Chroniclers record her as highly learned, fluent in Latin, skilled in scripture, and deeply intelligent. Some sources even claim she was trained at Wilton Abbey, a prestigious convent where noble daughters learned both holiness and statecraft. And when she returned, she was no longer a girl. She was a weapon in her father's grand design. In 1045, King Edward the Confessor, a deeply pious man and son of Ethelred the Unready, took Edith as his queen. It was not a marriage born of passion, but of politics. Edward's throne was fragile, his claim challenged, his authority thin, and the Norman influence at court growing. By marrying Edith, he allied himself with the most powerful family in England. The union sealed peace between the crown and the Godwins, at least for a time. The wedding was grand, filled with solemn oaths and golden feasts. Yet behind the smiles, the seeds of tension were already sown. Edward had spent most of his youth in exile in Normandy. He distrusted the English earls, particularly Godwin, whose influence over the kingdom was almost absolute. Edith found herself torn a queen by marriage, a Godwin by blood, caught between two loyalties that would one day tear her world apart. Though Edith was crowned Queen of England, her marriage to Edward was cold, perhaps even loveless. Chroniclers speak of the king's chastity. Some claim he took a vow of celibacy, others that he simply disliked his wife because of her father's dominance. Edward's piety earned him sainthood after his death, but for Edith it meant a lifetime without children, without heirs, without true affection. The queen's chambers were said to be separate from the king's, and though they lived under the same roof, they dwelt in different worlds, his in prayer, hers in politics. Yet Edith was not idle. She ruled the royal household with iron discipline, managing estates, rewarding loyalty, and cultivating influence. Her seal appears on royal charters, and her hand guided decisions when the king retreated into his spiritual seclusion. She was clever enough to survive neglect, and powerful enough to make neglect dangerous. The storm broke in 1051 when King Edward quarreled with Earl Godwin over a Norman insult to an English town. Edward demanded Godwin punish his own men to please the Normans. Godwin refused. In a dramatic showdown, Godwin and his sons were exiled from England. and Edith the Queen was stripped of her lands, her servants, and sent to Wilton Abbey in disgrace. The king even attempted to annul the marriage, but no priest dared oppose the daughter of Godwin so openly. It was a moment of utter humiliation. Yet in exile, Edith did not despair. She waited. The Godwins were nothing if not patient, and fate would soon turn. By 1052, rebellion erupted across England. The people and things, weary of Norman influence, called for Godwin's return. Edward was forced to yield, and the House of Godwin swept back into power like a tide reclaiming the shore. Edith was restored to her throne. Her father regained his earldom. The family was once again supreme, and Edward, though still king in name, ruled only because the Godwins allowed it. That same year, Godwin died suddenly, collapsing during a feast. Chroniclers later claimed it was divine retribution, that he choked while denying his guilt in Alfred Thieling's death. But others whispered that it was simply the exhaustion of a man who had carried England's burdens too long. After Godwin's death, his mantle passed to Harold Godwinson, Edith's favorite brother. And now the House of Godwin stood at its zenith, its sons ruling nearly every corner of England, its daughter wearing the crown. In Edward's later years, his piety deepened. He built the great Westminster Abbey, the masterpiece of his reign and his gift to God. Edith oversaw much of the construction, personally managing the workers and funds. It would later become the burial site of kings, including Edward himself, and the eternal symbol of England's monarchy. While Edward prayed, Edith ruled. She mediated disputes, controlled royal patronage, and acted as the true head of the royal household. In effect, she became the silent power behind the Confessor's throne. But destiny was already sharpening its blade. When Edward the Confessor died on January 5, 1066, the realm held its breath. There was no heir. The marriage between Edward and Edith had produced no children, and England stood leaderless. The Witan, England's great council, chose Harold Godwinson, Edith's brother, as king, the last great Anglo-Saxon ruler. For Edith, it was a moment of both triumph and dread. Her brother wore the crown, but across the sea, William, Duke of Normandy, claimed Edward had promised it to him. And then came the storm of 1066. At Stamford Bridge, Harold crushed the Viking threat, led by Harold Hardrada and his own treacherous brother, Tostig. But days later, he marched south to face William the Conqueror at Hastings. The battle was brutal. The English shield wall stood firm until the very end, but Harold fell, struck by the arrow of fate. When the news reached Edith, she was shattered. Her brother dead, her dynasty destroyed, her people conquered. The world she knew, the world of Alfred and Athelstan, of Edward and Edgar, was gone forever. After Hastings, Edith's fate was a quiet tragedy. The Normans spared her, perhaps out of respect for her piety or her royal blood. She retired to Winchester, living out her final years in reflection and mourning. Even William the Conqueror, it seems, respected her. He allowed her to keep her estates in acknowledgement that she was no mere widow, but the last queen of the old England. She died around 1075, long after the fall of her house, and was buried at Winchester Cathedral beside her husband, Edward the Confessor. When pilgrims came to pray at the shrine of the sainted king, they often passed her tomb too, the queen who ruled beside a saint, the sister of a fallen king, the last of her kind. Edith of Wessex lived at the crossroads of history. She was queen during the final flowering of Anglo-Saxon civilization, and she lived to see its extinction. She was a woman of intellect, authority, and resilience, capable of ruling in silence, surviving disgrace, and commanding respect even from conquerors. She left no children, yet her bloodline ran in the veins of kings. Her story was the thread that bound together the end of one England and the birth of another. When history remembers her husband, it calls him Saint Edward the Confessor. When it remembers her brother, it calls him Harold, the last English king. But when it remembers Edith of Wessex, it remembers the queen who endured them both and lived to tell the tale.